We'll go ahead and get started. We've got three faithful in-person folks here, hecklers, as they are known. You know, and it's going to be such a thrilling presentation. I mean, it's probably going to rival the Tennessee-Alabama game fourth quarter, you know, undoubtedly. So we're setting now. We want to make sure Tom doesn't take the goalposts out of here, you know, after the presentation's done. Okay, all right, fair enough. So yeah, we do want to welcome you to the Social Security history, benefits, funding, future presentation. We get enough questions on Social Security that we thought it would be fun to dive in and be able to do one of those more in-depth pieces, similar to what we did to cryptocurrency in April. And so just by a quick way of review, January and July, we do a deep dive state of the markets update. I'll do just one quick plug here in terms of where we are in the markets as we dive into this. You know, no surprise to anybody here, but we've seen both the stock market and the bond market drop in a significant way. Stocks were down at one point about 25%. They've rallied since then, and they're in that down 20% range, let's call it. Bonds have, although not dropped quite as much as stocks, from a historical standpoint, have dropped more than we've ever seen, believe it or not. Going back to 1926, the worst one-year performance that we've seen in the bond market in the United States was down 8.1%, down between 15 and 16% right now in the bond market overall. So it's been, you could go back to 1793. Some scholars have gone back to 1793. We have not seen a bond market drop like we have here in the last 200 years. So we look at that. The good news is those bonds are not defaulting. The institutions are not going under, the US government or the corporate bonds or other issuers, municipal bonds. But as interest rates have increased, it's a seesaw effect there, and so bond prices do fall. They will be money good, as it said, at the maturity of their issues. But again, that price pressure right now. Now, the good news is that going forward, the yield to maturity on everything is far higher. So you look at treasury bonds that were sitting at 0.7%. Two-year treasury bonds were sitting at 0.7% coming into this year. They're now sitting at about 4.5%. So a huge increase, about a six-fold increase there. It just means that that yield will be paying us for many years to come. And so the outlook for both bonds from a yield perspective and paying us better going forward, but then also stocks. Believe it or not, again, companies have never made more money in any year to this point in a year as they have this year. So last year, there were record profits from S&P 500 companies. This year, we see even higher levels of profitability, but at the same time, we've seen stocks fall in price. And so what that means is that price to earnings ratio, again, is more compressed. So stocks are on sale relative to their historic norms, and certainly relative to the beginning of this year. So hopefully that provides just a little bit of an update. Always happy to take a call or sit down with folks that might have further questions on what's going on in stocks or bonds. But again, Social Security is our topic today. And as we dive in, what we thought we'd do is talk about history and benefits, kind of and intertwine those. Because we look back to 1935 when Social Security was begun, and there have been a lot of different changes to the benefits over time. And if we can sequence those and kind of unpack what those benefits are now, we thought that that might be helpful. As well, we'll be talking about the funding side of things. Austin has put on the nerd hat, and he will here for us in looking at the funding side of things, really doing a deep dive and showing kind of where we're at right now in terms of that funding trajectory and where we may be over the next 10 to 15 years. And then we'll talk about the future some as well. We will be talking about the different proposals that are out there that have been made to update the system so that we don't come to a period where benefits have to be cut automatically, which is where we're at in 2033 or 2034, whenever the Social Security Trust Fund runs out. So that's where we're headed today. If, of course, we've got our disclosure here, and we'll dive into the history. So going back, 1789, The US government provides pensions to disabled vets of the Revolutionary War. So, if we kind of think all the way back to the inception of our country, we can go almost all the way back and looking at either pension or insurance programs, because the US government recognized, okay, we've got these disabled veterans, they're the ones that actually won us the war, we've got to do something for them. And so they put in that pension for them. A few years later, Thomas Paine, famous author, published a book that basically outlined what he thought should be a public welfare system, all kinds of different benefits that would be for people based on pension, based on health insurance and other kinds of pieces put together. You roll things forward and you go outside of just the general US, and you look 1857, the first municipal pension fund was established for New York City police officers. So police officers recognized, of course, there's a higher likelihood of need based on potentially being injured, potentially having had that service, and so that was also a large group of people that could have enough sway to have that first municipal pension fund. Now, when we think about it on a national scale, I think it was in 1881, the German king at that time actually wrote a letter to the chancellor and said, hey, I think that we need to really look at the potential for a nationwide old age social insurance or a social security type of construct. I think it was Wilhelm I that wrote the letter outlining, and ultimately 8 years later, Otto von Bismarck designed that old age social insurance program, and it was adopted in Germany. Now, if we turn back the clock, one of the things that was driving Bismarck in that era was that you had a lot of folks who were in their 60s and 70s who had governmental service roles that didn't want to retire. There was unrest, the economy wasn't in great shape, and so they said, well, I'm just going to continue to work, I'm going to continue to collect this paycheck. There were also a lot of unemployed teenagers, 20s, 30s, men in particular, that were causing unrest. And so the thought process was, well, if we can push out some of the older folks, but give them a pension, give them what they need to be able to live on, we can hire some of these younger folks and get them off the streets. And so in 1889, there was legislation that was passed through ultimately in Germany that set that up. Now we're as well behind our British counterparts in Great Britain. The old age pension benefits and compulsory insurance for widows and orphans was introduced in Great Britain. There was actually a program that was prior to that that was issued where it was non-contributory. This one was actually contributory, where the British said, okay, well, you're going to have to pay for this benefit there. So we come up, and I believe it was around the same time that we had Massachusetts issuing its first pension. And so Massachusetts, I think it was in 1923, put together a pension fund. It's actually in 1909 that we had the first legislation introduced that was shot down in the US for some kind of social security. But it wasn't until 1923 that we saw this enacted kind of on a state level. And Massachusetts did that. They had people contributing, had it mandatory there. So we fast forward again in our history to 1935. This was when the Social Security Act was signed into law. And if we turn back the clock again there, we find that we were in the midst of the Great Depression. We had a lot of people that were unemployed, and we had a similar situation to what Otto von Bismarck in 1889 was facing, which was social unrest. A lot of governmental employees staying into their 60s and 70s wanted to be able to provide that benefit. And so we roll out Social Security and sign that into law. In 1936, it was the first assistance programs that were actually made payments on that behalf. And if we think back to the benefits then and how they were obtained then and now, way back then, when it was first rolled out, you had to have 5 years of work and you reached that qualifying age of 62. So they've scaled that up over time where, generally speaking, folks will claim at a later age, but you can still claim at age 62. But back when it was initially initiated, you have 5 years of work and reaching that qualified age. Now, the way that you qualify for it right now, of course, is you need 40 credits. You can earn up to 4 credits each year. And so it takes 10 years to get that full Social Security qualification done. You get for every $1,500 of income that you have essentially in a year, that earns you 1 credit. So you need about $6,000 of income in 10 consecutive years or 10 years over time. It doesn't have to be consecutive years, but that gets you your 40 credits. Now, either if you or your spouse has qualified through those 10 credits, then you're eligible for things like Medicare Part A and Part B. You have Social Security insurance for disability insurance. You have all of these different benefits once you qualify for those. And there are some benefits that you can actually qualify for at a younger age. So, imagine that you've just entered the workforce, you're only in the workforce for a couple of years, and you become disabled, but you have children. There are provisions that allow you to qualify for those benefits even prior to that 10 years of work there. So the benefits have changed over time, but generally speaking, we do have that stepwise function of qualifying for benefits and then the benefits being paid out either as folks get into their 60s or are disabled prior to that. So how are the benefits calculated at this point? Well, you take the 35 highest years of income and you adjust that for inflation. So if you took a couple of years off because you were in grad school or kids came or something happened with a disability, then that doesn't count against you, but it also doesn't count for your benefit. You've got to look at that highest 35 years. So in one case, let's just say that you were at age 23, that you started getting a great salary and you were paying fully into the Social Security benefits. There's always an earnings cap that you don't pay Social Security beyond that earnings cap. If you have 35 of the highest years that you can have, say from age 23 to age 57 or 58, then you can't get a benefit that's any stronger than that. So it's that highest 35 years adjusted to inflation. Now, for most of us, our careers started at a particular point and we have higher and higher earnings relative to even inflation. And so we start to replace, when we get into our 50s, our mid to late 50s, we start to replace those first years of earnings because perhaps by that point, our earnings are higher than maybe when we were 22 or 23. Now, of course, even if you go back and you had a job, bagging groceries in middle school, that would count as well. You just have a much lower income there. So you have that primary insurance amount that's calculated, and it's going to be calculated to give you a benefit at your full retirement age. Now, for those who are in my generation, our full retirement age is age 67. For those who are in their 70s right now, that full retirement age is 66, was 66. For those in between, there's a stepwise function where we're moving through it right now, but it's between 66 and age 67. So if you defer your Social Security benefits, they increase on a month-to-month basis. So if you're age 67, you're due your full benefits, you defer those benefits, that steps up 8% per year, but it actually steps up a certain amount every month. It's about 2/3% every month that you defer. By contrast, if you take those benefits early, if you took them, say, at age 62, but your benefits were set to begin at age 66, let's just say, then you would only get about 3/4 of the benefit. You'd have about 75%. So if you claim prior to your full retirement age, then your benefit is just decreased by about 6% per year. It's not quite on that, but it's that amount, roughly speaking, if we average it. If you defer claiming, again, you have an 8% step up, about 2/3% every month. Okay, great question. So how is it inflation adjusted for the 35 years? So if you think about it, it's going to be based on what the wage cap was, back 35 years ago. And so there's going to be, if we had, let's just say, I don't know what the wage cap was in 1980, but let's say we go back to 1980 and the wage cap was, $50,000. It may have been less than that. It may have been closer to $40,000. But let's just say, again, if the wage cap was $40,000 and you had $20,000 in there, then you're roughly speaking going to have half of the wage cap filled up there. This year, our wage cap is at $147,000. And so, roughly speaking, that $20,000 would be equivalent to about $73,000 or $74,000 back then. There's a calculation in a way that they do that, but you could kind of look back and be able to see wage cap and see how that's stepped up over time with inflation, because that's going to be an inflation adjusted amount. And you'd be able to see, if we work our way backwards, you'd see that based on an inflation adjustment, that $20,000 in today's dollars would be worth about $75,000 or $73,000. Is that what we were looking for there? If that's not, then we'll follow up at a deeper level there. Any other questions? Okay. You can see that the contribution rates from earnings for Social Security have not always been the same. I think they started off at a very low level, something like 1% back in 1935, and they realized very quickly that the program was popular, and so they increased it to 3% fairly quickly. If we look at the last 50 years or so, you can see since the mid-60s here what the numbers have been. And if we go back to say the mid-60s, the base contribution, that would be the amount that is for Social Security, was at 7.8%, whereas for everything else it was for 1%. So as we roll things forward, you can see that base contribution at 8.4%, again, that would be split employer and employee. That's just for Social Security, that 8.4%. Now the all other earnings is Medicare. So that used to be 1.2%, let's say in about 1969 there. You can see how both of those numbers have stepped up, and in the 1980s, we got to a place right around 1980 where base contributions were 10.2% for Social Security, and then Medicare was a little over 2%. And then finally, as we get into the late 80s and early 90s, you can see the early 90s was the last step up when we have base contributions at 12.4%, again split 6.2% for the employer, 6.2% for the employee, and then Medicare 2.9%, with that being split again between the employer and the employee. So from 1986 forward, we haven't seen Medicare step up. That's been 2.9% steady from there. In 1990, from then on, we've seen base contributions at 12.4%. We haven't seen those deviate other than for the global financial crisis. We did see a couple of years coming out of that trying to stimulate the economy where those payroll taxes were cut. And you could see, I think that was 2011, they cut it 2% and kept it there for a couple of years and then bounced it back up to 12.4%. So again, going back to our history lesson, I know this is edge of your seat exciting here. We will ask the in-person audience to restrain themselves. Austin's doing a great job with that. But the federal unemployment tax, of course, increased to 3% of payroll in 1938. And you can see some of the different benefits that were added from there. The survivor benefits were added to a retiree spouse and kids. There was a reciprocal agreement between US and Canada. So one of the things that would be unfair is if you worked in both countries and were able to get a pension that was really strong. The way that you would end up doing that is if you had really strong earnings and you worked for 20 years in one country and 20 years in another, the way that the calculations are done in both countries, they help folks that have a lower level of income than higher level of income. So you could have a much higher level of benefit if you had some income for 15 or 20 years in both countries. So there was a reciprocal arrangement that was adopted there to kind of make that fair over time as well. Now, benefits, again, began to be paid to dependent widower and spouses under 65 with children under care and divorced spouses in 1950. And then you can see that benefits, they ultimately allowed to be payable to women at age 62 as well. So there was a level of unfairness between the spouses there in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s until that was rectified. And then finally in 1956, disability benefits were kind of solidified in more of their current state that we find today. So I want to touch briefly the survivor's monthly benefit eligibility. This would apply to any widow or widower age 60 or older. It can also actually apply to a surviving divorced spouse under certain circumstances. So if the spouse was not remarried or not remarried until after age 60, then that benefit can apply to that person as well. A widow or widower at any age while caring for a deceased child who's under 16. So the government recognized that it is really important to be able to take care of those kiddos. And so the kids would be able to receive the benefits, but then the widow or widower would also receive the benefits if they have a child under 16. Finally, an unmarried child of the deceased who's either under 18 or over 18 with a disability that began sometime in their childhood there. As you might expect, the amounts received would be based on the category and the age of the surviving beneficiary. So the amounts received would also be dependent by the earnings history of the deceased there. And then finally, there is a limit. There is a maximum family benefit, which usually is between 150 and 180% of the primary insurance amount. So let's just say that, I'm age 35, I have a good income. It looks like that my primary insurance amount out at age 67 would be about $3,000. Let's just say that I have 2 kids and a spouse, and I become disabled. The maximum family benefit in that situation would be somewhere between $4,500 and $5,400 on a month-to-month basis. They wouldn't allow the benefits, if you had 6 kids, they wouldn't allow the benefits to continue to accrue across the entire family. There is a cap that's on that. So categories of Social Security benefits. We've got the old age and survivors insurance, and that's what would typically be remembered as Social Security for most of us. You think of filing for Social Security benefits sometime between age 62 and age 70 based on the FICA payments that you've had over the course of your working years. That's what most of us think when we think Social Security, but it also has some different benefits. That supplemental social insurance is basically to be able to help out folks who have a disability and are poor. So the average benefit there is far less than the Social Security disability insurance. So SSI is principally for those folks who are disabled but have a very low income. Social Security disability insurance is based on just the disability of a person. Doesn't matter if they have $1 million of income a year or no income in a given year. It's based on how much they paid into the system over time. So those are 2 different benefits. The supplemental social insurance side of things, you can qualify for much more quickly. I think the government recognizes that if you have no income and you're disabled, they want to try to get you that income quicker. The Social Security disability insurance, you have a 6-month waiting period from the time of your disability. And then finally, the one-time death benefit. You have a benefit there. Your family receives a benefit of $255 when you pass away, and that has not been inflation adjusted or changed for quite some time. So kind of wrapping up our tour down memory lane here, you could see in 1960 that one-time lump sum death benefit was introduced. In 1961, the project of all projects, issuing Social Security ID numbers and cards for everybody to reduce cheating. Even back in the 60s, 50s, apparently there was a lot of cheating within the government and a lot of benefits that were being claimed. And so, you go back and that's why they issued those in 1961. In 65, Medicare passed into law, so there wasn't good health insurance for a lot of folks as they aged prior to then. So in 65, that was passed into law. There were also some other benefits there issued. You could see the cost of living adjustment first allowed in 1972, and that basically set in place a motion that just allowed the government to calculate that annually rather than look at it every 5 years and do a big update in one fell swoop. You could see in 1983, one of the last pieces that was a big piece of legislation that moved through, increased that full retirement age from age 65, which it had been, again, since 1935 when it was put in place, up to age 67 over a 22-year period. And so we're just getting to the end of that period here. And then in 1995, one of the things that we'll come back to is where are we in terms of the trust fund? But in 1995, the trustees report said that they were expecting the exhaustion of the trust fund to be at 2030, which was about a year different from the prior year. So I just thought I'd throw that out there because here we are 27 years later. The trust fund is set to expire in about 2033, but we've known for 27 years, that we've got issues here. We just haven't done enough about them legislatively. So we'll talk here some about the funding trajectory, and I'll turn things over to Austin.
Okay, so funding trajectory. This is where the fun begins, right? If the money's going to run out, we got to figure out why it's running out and when it's going to run out. So we'll just take a quick look. So what we're seeing here is these are the projection. These are split into two categories. So we've got, this is, if you look at both trust funds, so there's two trust funds for the Social Security program. You've got the old age survivors insurance and you've got disability insurance. So this is all income sources for both of those trust funds. The darker blue line is the income from earnings. So as Spencer talks about earlier, the 12%, 12.4% that is taxed on earnings up to $147,000. That is what goes into the old age survivors insurance, the OASI trust, or as well as the disability. And then the interest, every year on June 29th, the government is allowed to buy new bonds to replace the bonds that have come to expiration. Through day to day, they can buy special issues, but on June 29th is where they can buy the new 1 year rated bonds. So whatever the closing price of the bond was the day before, or the closing interest rate, that's what they can buy at market rate. So it doesn't depend on what rate you get through the year. It's on June 29th, whatever the rate is, that's what you get to buy the bonds are. So kind of interesting there. But as you can see, we look at, what I like to see here is, if you look at 1970, the very beginning, there's a real small spread between the earnings, the income from the earnings to the interest income. So if we hover over here, the trust fund earnings from income were only about 20 times greater than the interest earned. But as we scroll further on, if we come out to 2021 or right around here, we're at 14.5 times. But we come out to 2030, interest rates have dropped so much, and the earnings that we're getting from income are 137 times less than, or the interest is earning us 137 times less. So while it is helpful to have interest-bearing investments within these trust funds, it really doesn't push the needle forward in terms of how we're going to keep these funds trusted, or keep the trust funds with income in them. So the chart here, it looks at, if we're only looking at the old age survivor insurance, the Social Security insurance, and the disability separately, uniquely, we can see that, through the 80s, they were kind of on par with their funding. And actually, the Social Security primary trust fund is the one that's set to expire. So anytime you hear the trust funds are set to expire, it's the Social Security primary that's set to expire. Disability actually is projected to maintain its funding, and that's primarily because it funds less people, because there's not as many people that can cover a disability claim. As Spencer was saying, there's that waiting period. So to be able to claim a disability through Social Security, there are pretty high standards that you have to meet. And so because there are higher standards and not everyone receives it, that trust fund is going to set to be funded for a lot longer. But you can see right around the late 2015s, it really starts tapering off. We've got about $2.8 trillion in the mid 2010s, and then it just kind of starts to taper. And so we'll see how that projection comes over these next slides. But you see there's this great earnings increase. And really, if you think about it, when you think about we'll talk about fertility rate later, but right after World War II, when baby boomers came in, those families had significantly more children than the sequential generations. And so right about that 30, 40 years post World War II is when we see those individuals coming into their peak earning years. So there's a really exponential growth in the amount of earnings that are coming into that trust fund, which are now starting to taper off as that generation starts to retire. So if we take a look, here's the net change in the old age survivors insurance trust fund at the end of the year. So you can see every year go until about the early 80s, the trust fund is either staying flat, but then once it starts passing 1986, I believe is about the year, it starts to really grow. And that's, again, looking back to that last chart, that's where those assets in the fund really start to increase. And so you get at the peak in early 2000, about 180, I think that's $180 billion. I made a mistake making that little tooltip, but there's about $180 billion of net change being added into the trust fund. So more going in than is being taken out. Whereas we look now and we're about $60 billion coming out, and we're not able to replace it fast enough. So we're not having as much earnings going in, those taxes on the earnings, because it's been flat for so long, and because we don't have as many workers in the system right now, it's not able to sustain the need that is being pulled out with the earnings that are being put in. Clear? Super exciting. Okay, this is the fun part. So again, you look at it, and what I find fascinating is I actually looked at one of the trust reports from 1986, and it projected that it actually was projected that the trust fund would grow until 2020, and it would start slowing its growth in 2020, where in reality, the growth really starts slowing at about 2010. That's where costs began to exceed the non-interest income. So in 2010, costs started exceeding, and it's about 10 years prior to when they projected in 1986. So as Spencer mentioned before, 1995, they realized that it's going to run out. And even 10 years before that, they're projecting out and seeing our costs are rising at such a substantial rate that it's going to surpass the projected income by 2020. Obviously, that happened 10 years earlier. So we're starting to see that the trust fund assets are running out, and we've known about it for a very long time.
And none of this takes into account the pandemic, all these people not working and not paying into it.
Correct. Yeah. Pandemic is accounted for. Global financial crisis is accounted for, because in 1986 and 1995, you can't predict when those are going to happen or if they're going to happen. And so it's just fascinating to me to think we're, in one sense, in those late 80s, we're seeing these income earners that are finally being able to push funds into the system. And in some ways, it's a very positive thing because you can see the growth. But I think in a negative constraint, we didn't start taking proactive steps to deal with the problem. We rather just kind of.
Do you know what percentage people actually have income above that maximum?
12%, yeah. Yeah. It's
make a whole lot more than 147.
Yeah, 147,000. Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's about, I think the high income earners are in that 12% range above 147 that you just.
What kind of level of income that accounts for?
Right. And so we'll get into some of those, like what could happen, how could we actually fund the trust funds in a little bit, but it's just interesting to me that we've known about this for a long time. We've known that this is coming, and we still haven't done anything about it. So as you can see, the peak comes at, I believe this is 2020. We have the peak amount of combined trust fund assets. Everything after 2021, those are all projections. So anything we see into the future, we're projecting out based on what the government anticipates is being requested from Social Security and what is going in. And they put out several 100-page documents. So if you're really interested in seeing how they come to these statistical figures, some people think it's interesting. Not everybody does. I got lost in a few of those trust fund reports because it's interesting to see how they're projecting longevity, how they're projecting a rate of immigration, because oftentimes immigrants will pay into the system because they're paying in on wages that are earned, but not receiving benefits. So immigration has an influence on Social Security as well, whether or not there's lots of factors there, but there's people that pay in that receive no benefit as well. But that's all calculated in. The government knows it, so they take it into consideration. So this is looking at the fertility rate. So we alluded to it earlier, but you look and you see in the early 40s, we're at about 2.23 births per woman. So fertility rate, that's how it's calculated by the government, is every woman at this time, quote unquote, every woman was having about 2.2 children on average. There's some that have more, there's some that have less. And it continues, and it continues to grow to 3.8. And then it peaks in the late 50s at 3.6 children being born per woman. And then what you see thereafter is that's the big baby boom post World War II, and then it tapers back down. So by the 1980s, we're at 1.7, 1.8 births per woman. Guys, we don't count. But we just see that the fertility rate has dropped. And so you think about workers that are paying into the system. When you have 4 workers per essentially 2 adults, you've got twice as many workers paying into the system for every individual that needs to come in, where now we're getting to a place where my generation is starting to enter our peak earning years. But if they're only 1.8 or 1.7, 1.7 and a half births per woman, we have less people paying in for more adults. So I have 2 parents that have not started drawing Social Security yet. And if I was an only child, my earnings would have to cover both of my parents. So that's why that's part of this reason that we are in, because our fertility rate had dropped to a place where we are not replacing the income of both spouses, where in the earlier years of Social Security, we have multiple children paying for less parents. And they're projecting out, the birth rate has climbed back up to 2, and then it dropped back down to 1.6 in 2020. But they do project out as the government's looking forward, they're projecting a 2.0 fertility rate into the future. They have 3 different estimates that they use. They've got an intermediate, which is the one that we're taking into consideration. They also have a low end and a high end as well. But we're just going to take the intermediate because it's the easiest. So continuing on, so fertility rate is one thing, but let's also take into consideration life expectancy. In the early 40s, the life expectancy, if you reach the age of 65, for men, your total life expectancy would have been about 77 years. So once you reach 65 years old, because if you don't reach 65, that pulls the life expectancy down. So we're presuming that you've reached 65 at this time. You're gonna live to be 76.9 on average. For women, it's 78.4. So again, that's the very early 40s. When you look now though, we are at 81.9 years for men and 84.5 years for women. So there's an increase in life expectancy for those individuals who reach the age of 65. For women, they're living 6.1 more years. For men, we're living 5 years longer. So not only do we have this decrease in fertility, but we have an increase in longevity. So the generation that is receiving benefits now is living longer with less people paying in to supplement those incomes. So that's why we're in a situation is we've got longevity that's a benefit, which is a good thing. We're healthier, we're living longer lives. That's good. But we need to figure out solutions, because the more that happens, we're going to need to replace those funds. Or drop the benefit. Lots of ways we can get there. So what this chart is looking at is how many covered workers there are per old age survivor insurance and disability insurance beneficiary. So for the benefit, if you are receiving benefits from Social Security, this is how many workers we're paying into the system based on the benefits that are received. So in the 70s and 80s, it was as much as 3.7 workers per beneficiary. It's about 3.2 in 1980. You scroll forward to 2000. Again, in the 2000s, we've still got a lot of that baby boomer generation that are still in their peak earning years. So you've got about 3.4. In 2007, the global financial crisis hit. We have 3.3, but then workers start leaving the workforce. And so our workers per beneficiary drops to 2.8. In 2020, 2019, 2020, and 2021, it's 2.7, 2.8. And so, but if we look forward, these are, again, governmental projections into the future, out into the late 2040s, there's only going to be 2.2 workers per beneficiary receiving benefits. So again, the less workers paying in, the more people getting paid out, there's going to be a net deficit, so long as we don't do something about it. So like I was mentioning earlier, the government is allowed to buy bonds that are only issued for these trust funds. And so, like we said earlier, there is that big gap between the interest earned and the earnings from taxation for those benefits. But if you look in 1990, the average interest of those holdings was 9.1%. Today, the average interest is 2.3%. So we have seen a pretty substantial drop in the earnings, the interest-bearing earnings of everything that's held within that trust fund. And if you have a $2.9 trillion trust fund that's earning 2.3%, yeah, it is helpful, but it's not as helpful as when it's earning 9%. So obviously with higher interest, like Spencer was talking about, where yields are higher on bonds right now, yeah, that's going to be helpful. But again, if our trust fund is losing money, it doesn't really matter if we don't have, if it's just not, the interest isn't going to really push the needle forward. Yeah, 2% is going to help, but it's not going to make the changes that are necessary. And I've got this contrasted to the inflation rate that influences the Social Security cost of living adjustment. So you can see that that inflation rate is right about, you know, anywhere from 6% in the 90s to what it is today at about 8.5% for this last one that just came out. Okay, so if we look at three different periods, this is 1992 is in the orange, 2002 is in the gray, and 2022 is in the blue. These are the percent, how much of the holdings is on the y-axis is in these interest rated bonds. So you can see in the orange there, the average interest rate for the bonds in 1992 was 8.4%. So that really big line that's at about 30% here, in 1992, 32% of the bonds had an interest rate of 8.75%. So a third of the bonds within the trust fund had an interest rate of 8.8% essentially. Whereas our biggest holdings right now are in bonds that have a 2.25% interest rate. So a fifth of the bonds that are in the trust fund right at this moment are only yielding 2.25%. And we can't replace those holdings. We can replace some of them that expire on a daily basis with whatever's allowed daily. But the next big issue that we can purchase isn't until June of next year. So if interest rates start coming down, we're not going to be able to replace the long bonds with new long bonds until June of next year. So I think this is an interesting indicator as well. So this is the average annual years to maturity of the bonds that are being held within the trust fund. And so you look at this, and starting back in 1990, the average yield to maturity when those bonds were set to mature was 7 years. The way that the government is required to purchase bonds into the system is they look out and they see when our funds anticipated needing to be paid, and they buy bonds based on when those payments are going to need to come out. And so they said, okay, there's about 7 years that we need to start covering. And so they're trying to get those bonds to mature at that time so that they can then replace them and pay out, but also buy in new ones. And so that yield to maturity increases. Again, this is part of that exponential growth that we saw of the trust fund assets. So they can buy longer bonds in the early 90s in through the 2000s. Again, the assets are still rising. You can still hold them for longer. But what I find really interesting is in 2019, that's about when the trust fund assets are reaching their peak. So the government now is looking at it and saying, we're starting to run out of money in the trust fund. And so what do? They pull back that yield to maturity, and it's starting to come down 6.5 years, 6.7 years, 6.3 years. They're realizing that they're running out of money in the trust fund. So they're shortening the amount of time before those bonds mature so that they can hedge and make sure that the people that are receiving benefits will continue to receive benefits until the trust fund expires. So they're everything that they're doing is they're projecting out to what will happen, but they're not taking proactive steps other than just making sure that the benefits continue to get paid. So it's there's constant motion in there, but there's not steps being proactively taken to resolve the issue. So Spencer, you want to come finish this off?
I just want to say that Austin and I are doing our parts. 4 kids in our crew, 3 kids in his crew. We're trying to get workers out there to be able to sustain Social Security. We look at potential outcomes here, and I was in a talk a couple of years ago listening to Senator Blackburn unpack some things, and somebody raised Social Security, and she said, yeah, it's a really important thing. She is on a committee trying to push legislation forward, but she said there's 0 chance that we're ever going to see, she didn't say ever, that we're going to see in the next year or 2 any legislation on Social Security. She said it's not going to be on the table. It's one of the things that she said is really important, but is not going to be addressed by the government. So I just thought that was an interesting take. And of course, that's proven true, over the last couple of years. Nobody's really been serious, I don't think, dating back to about 2010. So in 2010, we had the Simpson-Bowles Commission. This was a bipartisan effort. You had Simpson from the right side of the aisle, Bowles from the left side of the aisle, 2 well-respected leaders. And part of what they put together in this commission, which the commission was broader, it was trying to look at how do we responsibly fund government? How do we basically pay our bills? How do we get the deficit down? And one of the, I think, 6 parts of the commission's report was related to making Social Security sustainable. So you had a lot of really thoughtful things that were put together in this committee. And because it was so thoughtful and because it made so much sense, it was immediately tabled and has never been talked about again in Washington, D.C. So I say that tongue in cheek, but there were a lot of really smart things that people from both sides of the aisle came together and said, yeah, we could do this, this, and this. And it was, dead on arrival in committee, apparently. So one of the things for making the Social Security side sustainable was lowering benefits for higher income earners. Another one was increasing normal retirement to age 69 by 2075. So, this moves at a glacial pace, but you could see, in 1983 legislation, we were changing that full retirement age from 65 to 67 over 3 decades. Well, what they said was, well, we actually need to move it to 69 because we're living longer. But that has not been touched at all. We could have all workers pay Social Security taxes on the first 90% of income that would be earned. And again, that would have been $190,000 by 2020. It was $168,000 back then, but basically increasing that earnings cap. That obviously was not taken and put into effect. Another thing that they said was, let's just make sure that workers who have paid into the system at least 25 years, they're guaranteed a rate of Social Security that's above the poverty line there. And then cover, there are some states and workers and municipalities that are not covered by Social Security. And they said, well, we just need to bring everybody under the fold because by and large, those folks that are outside of the Social Security fold have been less satisfied with what their benefits are than what Social Security is. And then the final one was using the chained consumer price index for cost of living increases. Now, I'm really going to put on the nerd hat here to get into the chained consumer price index versus the unchained. But the chained, basically, the logic is this. If you are a consumer and you want to make dinner for the night and you find that lettuce is really, really expensive, instead of getting lettuce for your one of your vegetables and making a salad, maybe you will buy cucumbers and you will make a cucumber salad. So basically it looks at things and says, well, consumers we know how to kind of move our dollars around. And so if we can't get one thing, then we'll get something else that's kind of like it. And so if that something else that's kind of like it doesn't cost as much, then the consumer price index can be chained to this kind of basket of goods in a little different way so that inflation doesn't step up quite at the same rate. So they said, let's use chained consumer price index for cost of living adjustment increases, because that will move those COLA increases up at a lower rate there. So now I return to the normal programming there. Some other potential proposed solutions. As I mentioned, right now we're at an earnings cap, and I apologize, in both the published slides and the ones that we printed off for today, we had this a misprint there, but it's actually $147,000 this year. We had it printed at 127, so I apologize, but it's 147 this year. But you could move that up, and you could skip the zone between 147 and 400, and then start to include those over 400. You know, 400 kind of is the magic number that we come after people now in the government. So if you make over $400,000, then some of the tax credits that you would receive otherwise start going away. And so at any rate, this has not been implemented, but it would help to fund Social Security overall. You could eliminate the earnings cap entirely. So if we did that, it would move the needle. Susie, to your point, I'm not sure how much it would move the needle. It would definitely, be a significant move. It wouldn't fully fund it. I know I wanted to say that it was something like $1 trillion move over the next, period of time when they had evaluated it. President Biden had put that as one of his things that he wanted to have reviewed by the CBO, I think, in one of his proposals. And so it was a big move, but it wasn't enough to fully fund, things overall. From the research that we had done, it only impacts, somewhere between 10 and 12% of the population. The wealthy would not see an increase in benefits in this proposal. So you can't just give more benefits with the greater taxation. You'd have to keep the benefits the same. Now, one of the most common sense things, I think, and this of course was in the Simpson-Bowles proposal, but it would be increasing the full retirement age. So we think back to, I think, the early 1980s, and we've seen an increase in the life expectancy. Once you get to age 65, the increase in life expectancy by, I think it's something like 4 years since that time, but we've only increased our full retirement age by 2 years. So that's not a huge differential in there, but it's significant. And so if we could continue to increase that full retirement age, that would help us. So you could, help that with the life expectancy piece in there. As I mentioned, we could change to a cost of living adjustment that would be a chained CPI. That's a more conservative measure of inflation. And you could do that with substitute goods. You could freeze the purchasing power of benefits for the wealthier recipients, so they wouldn't get that cost of living adjustment. So if you had income that was at a certain threshold, it might be a couple $100,000, or it could be a lesser number of income, then you don't have a step up in terms of your cost of living there. That's another proposal. You could eliminate all cost of living adjustments. I don't think that this is really one that's being considered very significantly, just because, sadly, there are more than half of folks who enter retirement with almost nothing beyond Social Security. So if we don't have any kind of cost of living adjustment for them, we're going to have more folks that are indigent and require more services from the government. So that's kind of one of those things that we could do away with that cost of living adjustment, but how much would it actually help us in the long run there? You could means test for benefits. So this is one of those that, again, you could say if you have an annual income threshold, not only do you not receive a cost of living adjustment, but perhaps your benefits are cut overall. So that has been proposed. That hasn't really gotten much traction, simply from the standpoint that folks who are higher income folks say, well, I've been paying into the system for a long time, and this has been in my financial plan for a long time. Please don't just cut out benefits. Let's find a different way. You could progressively link longevity to benefits. And so You could index full retirement age to longevity. There are ways that you could do that. Again, that hasn't gotten as much traction. Using the estate tax to cover the shortfall, trying to come up with a way to even do the estate taxes is not all that easy if we lowered that in some ways in terms of the exemption. So I don't think these last ones that we've talked about here are as likely as maybe some of the first ones in terms of increasing that full retirement age or increasing the earnings cap there. There's a proposal that's out on the table that you'd eliminate the payroll tax entirely and just do a VAT, a value added tax. Again, that hasn't seen too much traction. The one that we want to highlight here is one that if we just said, okay, what do we have to increase that payroll tax? If we did it right now, what would we have to do it to make the system sustainable going forward? So let's keep the same earnings cap. Let's keep the same benefits. What do we have to increase payroll taxes? Well, we'd have to take them right now from 12.4% all the way up to 15.75%. So we'd have to increase by about 3.33%. So that could be split evenly between the employee and the employer. You'd have something like 1.6 or 1.7% apiece on either side. So, it's not something that's, fun to look at, but if we said, okay, if we acted today, it would be about 3.3%. Now, Austin and I think, if we kind of move things forward into the 2030s, if we deferred to that point, it would be closer to 4% in terms of the move. So you'd have to go from, say, 12.4% to something like 16.4%. So, so you could pull multiple levers, and that's what Simpson-Bowles came back to is, why don't we increase the full retirement age? Why don't we increase the earnings cap? Why don't we, all these different things, why don't we do it all together and we'll be fine? But again, that was 12 years ago and we didn't do any of it. So we give ourselves less latitude the farther that we go. And then finally, if we don't cut benefits or if we don't do anything, there would be projected to be a benefit cut in 2034 of 21%. As I mentioned, there's a shortfall that if we would have addressed it in 2017 and just immediately increased payroll tax by 2.6%, we could have done it then. It's now about 3.3%. It'll probably be closer to 4%, by the time we would wind things forward in 2034. But by law, the Social Security Trust Fund cannot pay out anything beyond, it can't go into the negative there, we'll just say. So if the trust fund expires, we can only pay out what we have coming in. We can't go into debt on that, at least under current law. So there would be an automatic benefit cut that would be 21%. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. We've got folks going to the polls today, and one of the things that legislators know are that folks who are retired vote. And, so you're not going to see, legislation, I don't think, have significant cuts. I think that's one of the reasons that both the Simpson-Bowles Commission was dead on arrival in committee, and then that we're not seeing the Senate really address things is because no one really wants to confront reality at this point. So that change of cost of living adjustment, there are some even unlikelier solutions. You could change it to the CPI-E, which would be for folks that are above 62, their projected cost of living adjustment or CPI. You could transfer startup costs to general government revenue. This is just a fancy way of saying every generation kind of has their own pool of funds. And once your pool is exhausted, or gets close to being exhausted, then, there's some changes that are made. We could phase out or end taxation of benefits. That kind of goes the wrong direction, but it has been proposed. You could eliminate the retirement earnings test. So that wouldn't help eliminate the windfall either. If we look at other kind of farther out proposals allowing for a partial or full privatization of the program, I don't think that's going to be really considered. And then offering folks who are in retirement a buyout, particularly wealthier folks who might be able to buy a one-time tax-free annuity. Again, I don't think that that's going to find much traction. but it would give a level of certainty in terms of the amount of the cost. I just think that we'd have a lot of challenges with that, because people whose life expectancy might be shorter would certainly be having an incentive to take that buyout without the government really knowing anything about their health there. So again, I think crystal ball wise, we'll get to a point here, maybe in the next 5-6 years, where it will be upon us. There will be some changes made. My guess would be some of it will be driven by what are the political winds at the time. We've seen more traction, in periods where we have more of a left-leaning Washington, D.C. environment, where you might find that the earnings cap is gone. You might have all of Social Security tax. That is Bernie Sanders' proposal. If you look at things on the other side of the aisle, Republicans have tended to say, well, let's try to tweak the cost of living adjustment benefits. Let's do change CPI. Let's kind of keep the costs down there. So it's anybody's guess. I think the sooner that we can tell people in my generation that full retirement age is not going to be 67, but it's going to be a higher number, probably the better, because I think that's only fair to begin with. So I think that would be one lever that I hope that we pull sooner rather than later, but that won't solve the full problem that we have. Now, the good news is, I think, what is it, out at 2060, something like that, we have our demographics come back more in line, where we have the number of people who should have worked, and then because we don't have a baby boomer generation where we have a lot more births relative to the prior or past population, we should be back more in line with demographics. But as challenging as our demographics can be, just be glad that we're not looking at what's happening in China, Japan, or Europe, where we really see some very, very challenging demographics. If you follow China, of course, the one-child policy, they have a whole generation of kids that oftentimes you'll have 4 grandparents and 2 parents, and you've got 1 child. So you've got 1 child potentially being in the workforce that might need to support 2 or 3 or even 4 people generations down the road. So it's going to be a difficult challenge for them. Japan is in a similar circumstance as is Europe, but they just don't have the same government mandated policies. They've gone kind of a different path. With that, thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and wish you all a wonderful evening.
This content was provided by Retirement Planning Services. We're in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.seriousretirement.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult with your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.